So when we think about God and we think about, all right, what is God's, what's his essential characteristic? I think there's a lot of people, a lot of people who would say that love is God's central or essential characteristic. But it's not, right? And we talked about this last week. God's essential characteristic is his holiness. And love comes out of that, absolutely. But that's not God, that's not the essential characteristic of God. Because God's love doesn't override God's justice or God's wrath. They're all perfectly the same, right? But I think what we have done in our culture is we have elevated God's love above all of his other characteristics. And it makes sense. It makes sense why, as human beings, we would do that. I mean, think about it. You turn on the radio and you listen to Christian music. What's most of the Christian music out there about? It's about the love of God. And rightfully so. We should celebrate and worship and sing about the love of God. It's amazing, right? Even when you come to church, even the songs we just sang were kind of centered around the love of God, right? So we hear about it all the time. The Bible has a lot to say about the love of God. There's not only instances in the Bible where we see God's love, but there's also great theology that Paul even writes about the love of God. So the love of God kind of it's big. It's kind of like forefront of everything else that God does. And so I think just out of a natural response, you and I might elevate God's love to be, God's love is his essential characteristic. And then the lost world does this as well. I don't typically post any type of political thing or Christian thing or anything on my Facebook. Facebook is really just for me to post hey, I'm traveling and look at what I'm doing, or here's my family, and it's more centered around my family and what I'm doing and travel than it is ideology or anything like that. But I was listening to a guy, this is back in the beginning of June, talk about how kids shows were adopting a lot of the LGBTQ ideologies in the kids shows. In little kids shows, 3 to 7 year olds, and they were having all this thing about, hey, whatever your family is, 2 moms, 2 dads, that's great. We're all, as long as we love each other, everything's good. And so I just took to Facebook and said, hey, listen, parents, understand, look at what your kid is watching, because a lot of these ideologies are coming into these kids shows. And I get the ease of just putting your kid in front of a TV so you can get some stuff done, and how that's probably pretty essential. But understand what they're watching. That's all my post said. I wasn't trying to make a dig at anybody. I was just trying to tell parents, hey, this is going on. Your kids might be watching something that you're not aware of. So my cousin, she's lost. She replied, how can you serve a loving God and hate people like this? And I don't blame her. I don't blame her. She's lost. And what do we as Christians always say about God? We say God is love. I mean, you turn on anything, and anyone who claims to be a Christian on TV, what do they talk about? They talk about God is love. Whether they're on CNN or Fox News or something else, what does the Christian pastor almost always say? They say that God loves you, right? And so I don't fault her for thinking that God's love is way up here. And so because God loves everyone, he can just accept for who they are, and he's just going to love them for who they are. That makes sense to me. It's just wrong, right? It's just wrong because, again, we can't overvalue God's love. God is love, right? It's a characteristic that defines who he is, and he proves it over and over and over and over again, but it should not be elevated above his wrath or his holiness or his justice. It shouldn't be elevated above those things. But I think a lot of times we elevate it way up there. We make it a central aspect of his character because it affects us in a very personal way.